Thanks everyone for joining our webinar on navigating the people experience. We're going to be talking through or introducing our framework for people experience and the way we think about the outcomes of surveys and all the rest of it. I'm Nick Core, I'm the CEO of the People Experience, and I'll let Rob introduce himself.
I am Rob Robson, I'm COO and Director of People Science at People Experience Hub.
Amazing. And I thought it'd be really useful actually to start talking about the People Experience Hub and where it came from. So for those of you who don't know, we started the business in end of 2018, beginning of 2019 as an idea, and we knew that we had to solve some problems, and kind of some of my motivations around that were general dissatisfaction with some of the surveys that I'd used before in companies like Tesco and Carlsberg and other companies that I'd worked in. And when I'd gone out on my own and set up a consultancy and started growing that consultancy, I was seeing those same problems repeating themselves. Problems around not solving problems. Many surveys felt mechanistic or systematic, and by that I mean that we were forcing people into fixed models of engagement or the term of engagement as people defined it or designed it. And I think there was a general, or I guess my dissatisfaction came from that it didn't feel like it was flexible enough for a modern world of work where different companies were having different problems, different groups in different companies, a large company that could be very similar to a smaller company, companies that encompass manufacturing, but companies that specialize in manufacturing. And kind of underpinning on some of this as well was the analysis of data, and it either felt hugely cumbersome or overly simplistic. And was it really leading people to the solutions they needed to solve as organizations, as people managers, as organizational leaders? So we decided we would build the tech from the ground up in terms of solving this problem and start building that. And we got it to a place where we were really happy. We ran out with some clients with a minimum viable product. So we knew the technology was in place and the ethos of flexibility was in place, but it wasn't quite where it needed to be. And I think this is where we're going to move into talking about how we develop the framework and everything else. But I guess I'm going to play host in this, and Rob's going to be the super interesting person on this webinar. But Rob, I guess I'll lead with a question for you, which is, we speak of solving problems, but in your eyes, as somebody who's got experience as a HRD in organizations and also coming out of that and your background in organizational psychology, what is the problem actually that we're trying to solve?
I think what you described at the beginning of being flexible and being relevant to the client organization's own business context is really important. But what big problem I think that's holding an awful lot of organizations back from actually getting more from their surveys is employee engagement, or almost their obsession with it, if that's the right word, because 30 years plus of research, we're still not entirely sure what it is. It's a bit of a holy grail. Everyone's chasing it. Where is it? What is it? And in that space, you've got commercial suppliers, survey providers, and other organizations selling their version of the truth. It's not the truth. So I really wanted to avoid that. But the other thing about employee engagement and this kind of unhealthy focus on it potentially is that sometimes it leads to surveys being misused as well. So it's the number in the annual report. it's a metric, it's a KPI that gets used to beat managers over the head with, and things like that. And that's really not the point.
It's interesting. It's interesting you talk about that, and I guess my experience tells me that employee engagement is a thing. Or actually, if I think about that, engagement is a thing. I mean, I know what I'm engaged in. I know what I have focus on. I know what I get enjoyment from. I know that I'm engaged in stuff. So employee engagement, it's a thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because all the early work and still the vast majority of the work on engagement doesn't focus on what we describe as employee engagement. It's versions of what we might describe as role engagement or work engagement. And that's exactly what you described, really, which is that I am engaged in my work. And that's quite easy to conceive of. We understand exactly what that is. And then its evolution and its introduction as a commercial kind of thing has led to this idea of employee engagement, which is at least two things. It's my relationship with my work and my relationship with my organization. And I don't think anything yet is adequately addressing that. And I think it's far more sort of nuanced and complex, and we need to deal with that. And I think the CIPD view, that they've actually kind of come out and published is that we need to think of employee engagement as a broad umbrella, broadly akin to people's strategy, under which lots of different constructs and ideas can sit. I think that's a pretty good kind of starting point. And I think it's important that we don't put too much stock in it as a concept, because you're right. Everybody has an idea of what we need to say that we want our people to engage. Everyone has some idea of what it is. It's a thing, and we've got it, and we can be fairly confident as well that it's a good thing. But it's maybe not just like the only thing or the best thing, or it's not part. It's not the whole picture. It's only part of the picture.
It's interesting, but also frustrating, I guess, because people will consume their knowledge. They get education from multiple sources, whether that be social media or trade magazines or specialist magazines. And the concept or the discussion around things like employee engagement seems to drift from put it in the bin, get rid of it, to well, actually, this is a standard concept. It is something that we do have. And if I hear what you've just said around, it is a thing. It is a thing, and I genuinely believe engagement as a concept is a thing. Then what should we do? Should we put it in the bin? What do we do with it as a concept?
No, I just think that we should be more cautious with it. I think we should put less stock in it. We should certainly not, like I say, use it as the KPI for people necessarily. Recognize it's more broad, nuanced, complex than it is, and then being a bit more academic about it. If I was to, I'd love to really get my teeth into it, and I think what that would mean would be, I think, take quite a radically different approach to it. I think there's at least, like I said, there's at least two separate concepts in there: my relationship with my work versus my relationship with the organization. But I even think it might be sort of more nuanced than that. And I think, if I was going into this from an academic perspective, I would go in and really try and understand that whole. But I like the CIPD view. I like the idea of just saying, look, it's a thing, but let's not let's just be a little bit careful here. Let's recognize that different things can sit underneath it, and let's look at what's relevant to us.
I guess that relevancy is, if I think back to the original motivation between what we started doing and the journey we've been on, that relevancy has always been the thing that frustrated me, which was I didn't understand how a fixed set of questions sitting under an acronym could apply across a rich tapestry of organizations, of rich group of people where we've got so much difference. And if I think about even just thinking about people in society outside of organizational thinking, we're exploring a lot of areas where old thinking is being challenged and new thinking is finding its way, and how do we introduce that into the common language, and how do we make sure that we have that relevancy about what we're doing. And I think what I'm hearing you describe is that engagement is something in the common language and therefore will not go away. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And it means different things to different people. It can mean, the process of being engaged. It could be the management practice of engaging people. It can be the feeling, of being engaged. And so, I think this is where I went when it came to starting to actually like develop a bit of a framework for us. I went, kind of deep into the literature, read some really great sort of meta-analyses and some really critical, analysis of what the research had been so far and stuff. And something really struck me is that, and it struck me before, and I actually remember saying this to you a little bit, when I think it was when we first met, or it must have been just after we first met. We were at a conference on the employee experience, and people. The employee experience was becoming a more popular concept. People are talking about it more and more, and still are. But actually, when you look at what people are talking about, they're talking about two things mostly. They're still talking about employee engagement, and they're talking about the touch points, the broad touch points across the life cycle that make up the employee experience. Not a lot of people are actually talking about experience. And when I looked at sort of the research and stuff, one of the things that I really kind of thought here is that we need to put the experience first in this. And we are, of course, the people experience hub, and that's probably no accident on your part when you started it. But I think it's engagement is one thing, or multiple things. But actually, let's understand it. Let's understand what people are actually experiencing at work. There's a question here.
Sorry to interrupt. We have had a question on our LinkedIn Live. Do you think the size and complexity of an organisation has a bearing on what they can deploy in terms of measuring or taking a pulse employee engagement / experience?
It has a bearing for sure, because even implementing a survey, whether it's an annual survey or a pulse, is something that needs to land well. People need to kind of understand what it's about, and you need to ultimately attract people to give the time and effort. I don't think it really has much of a bearing on the set of questions you ask. What it does have a bearing on is the analysis that you do, and the opportunity that a bigger organization lets you look at in terms of the layers of analysis. But we're going to talk a bit more about analysis later on.
I think there's a I think there's a point to be made, which is so the question, do you think the size and complexity of an organization has a bearing? And I think what we're doing is there's a risk that we conflate size and complexity, and I think my experience tells me that complexity can sit with any size of organization, and breadth of roles in a small organization. I remember the first time I went and worked into a food manufacturing business and found that they had research chemists and biologists and lab technicians, but they only had a few of them. So but they didn't have a lot of employees. So I think when we think about complexity, I think we do need to consider it in terms of what people can deploy. So I think if we look at this, the temptation to go back to that original fixed model, it's I can buy a survey, with a fixed set of questions, I can push it out with ease to a large business or a complex business, it would suggest that it actually is diminishing the value of the survey. Because what it's saying is the one size does fit all, and I'm valuing, or I'm potentially valuing, simplicity to deploy over the value of the survey that I'm going to get back. And when I think about complexity, we did a survey recently to 3,000 people, 16 countries, 11 languages, a very complex hierarchy across group companies, etc. The complexity was in the delivery. The questions were from our framework. The complexity was in the translations. And I think actually when you do deploy this, you can deploy a relevant solution for your organization, but also one that delivers, so relevant for your people, relevant for your organization, its stage, the people and the levels within the organization, but you can still deliver that with relevancy to your organization. And I think that's an important part of the overall framework that we're going to come on to discuss.
Yeah, that capacity, that simplicity to deploy isn't a value add. Insight's a value add. So that for any provider, ticket that ability to deploy is a ticket to the game. It's nothing else. So if that answers that question, we were talking about we need to do more about experience. We need to focus more on the experience, and I think there's something.
I was just going to circle back actually, Rob, on because you commented that when we set the business up, it was called the People Experience Hub. And we did kick around a few different concepts around the Employee Experience Hub and a few other bits. And the reason People Experience came in over Employee Experience was it was simply a case of that in my own experience that the most of the people sitting within an organization are employees, but not necessarily everyone that sits within an organization is an employee. There are lots of organizations that make a single organization work, and the ability to understand the people in your organization, number one, it felt more relevant, but also number two, it just felt a little bit more human. It felt a little bit more human that we were talking about people and not focusing on employees. And I think the other thing as well was a move away from hierarchical concepts of employees equal colleagues equal staff, and moving to a broader concept that said an organization is made up of its people and the people that work within and for that organization, which might be contractors and subcontractors and agency workers, as well as directly employed individuals.
And executive leadership and everyone else. Yeah. So that one thing we're talking about experience, and the thing that I noticed is that everyone wants a great people experience, but the language that's used is very much sort of implies that there is this idea that the experience lies on a single scale from rubbish to great, and all of the nuance is missing there. There are different types of experience, and that's really important, because it has to reflect your business context, and different types of experience, which we'll come on to in a moment, different types of experience will support that, like the business goals and things like that, in different ways. And so another problem that I really wanted to solve in developing this framework was providing something that can ultimately be both business focused and appealing to people in terms of the experience. And it's that linking those different types of experience to the business goal that's important.
I'm going to be challenging, Rob, and so you led in with, people are focused that they want to have a great people experience, and then experiences on a scale of rubbish to great, but actually the reality is it sits in multiple points between that scale for various times. But shouldn't people be aspiring to giving a great people experience and understanding, because in my head, what we do as an organization should be about showing people where there's friction, where stuff doesn't run as smoothly as it could run, where there are barriers to individuals or teams delivering. So is there a difference between that aspirational goal of a great people experience, or should people aspire to something different?
No, I think they should aspire to a great people experience. Why not? But it's recognizing that what's great here is not great there.
Right.
In other words, you have to take the business context into account,
and the people context.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it needs to be both. There's the Venn diagram here. Meets the needs of the business, meets the needs of its people, and an experience that does both of those things is going to be both engaging, shall we use that word, and supportive of actual business outcomes, because ultimately that's what we're there for. And the thing is, you've got to make, you can't just go out there and say, I'm going to buy this recipe for a great people experience, because it doesn't exist. There's no blueprint. There are elements in common, but the relative importance of those elements is going to be different in different places. I used the example another time of, what works at Netflix is not going to work at National Grid. Not exactly. There'll be similarities, but there'll also be differences in the things that are important. And that's where it relates to things like values, culture, etc., etc. But if Netflix and National Grid have exactly the same people experience or culture, or whatever you want to describe it, then something will go wrong in one of those places, because one of them is fundamentally a more creative business, and one of them is fundamentally about delivering, power safely. And so there has to be differences in those. And so so HR people and business leaders have to make choices. They have to be able to sort of place their bets on different types of experiences ultimately.
I think I know we're going to start leading into the framework in a minute, and I think the challenge I guess for people who are watching this on LinkedIn or Twitter or attending it direct as the webinar, or watching this, I keep going back to that flexibility approach, that design of relevancy, of flexibility, of meeting the needs of people and organizations, and being able to, and I guess we're an organization, so being able to scale and also being able to stay relevant as we do that was really important to me. And I remember when we talked early on, the task was a tough task. So the task was one which was, how can we create a framework? So if I describe our journey from the product that we released, and the approach that we released was we will bespoke for every client. We'll understand every client's needs. And what we realized was number one, we were asking very similar questions on a relevant basis. And I think that's the bit where you said some stuff is the same. And then we was bespoking. And building that flexibility into a framework, which by its very nature has hard boundaries and walls. And I remember the comment was, how can we build freedom into a framework? How can we build that approach that gives us the flexibility, that gives our partners that we're working with the information they really need to improve the employee experience, the people experience, but develop a framework and that moves us away from the concept of engagement. And that was the challenge. And I think it was a good challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I actually think, and I mean, I've seen it, so I kind of got the inside. That actually we are in a really good place now where we have some of that flexibility. So could we start talking through the framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to add that we also wanted to be evidence-based, and there is a little bit of a tension there. So we spent a lot of time looking at the literature, looking at research and stuff. But what we knew is that meant we didn't want to wed ourselves to like one theory. So it's really about weighing up lots of different things and trying to integrate those into one overarching framework that, as you say, gave us some flexibility. So I hope you can see can you see the slide there?
I can.
Yeah. Okay. So what this led us to is at a high level, a really basic framework. Okay, with 3 components. The first of those is what we describe as the perceived environment. And this is all the touch points, those touch points, those levers, those things that can be managed in the organization. It can be seen, felt, touched. So things like management, leadership practices, people policies, physical environment, and all that sort of stuff. And those are the sort of things that you find in most employee surveys anyway. Then you've got what we describe as the felt experience, and this for us is the core of the framework, the core of the people experience. And this is that when the person sees and hears and touches and all that sort of stuff, that environment, what happens? How do they feel? Now, I'd love this to be based on emotions, but actually they're not very practical and easy for people to operationalize. So we've taken a step back from that and said, this is kind of if you like, evaluations, positive evaluations of people's experience within the organization. And we're going to describe that in a little bit more detail in a moment in the next page. But the third part of this is what we describe as observable outcomes. And usually these are either motivational or behavioral intentions, but they can also be performance. We're often, more and more, we're using well-being outcomes in here. But typically, the most typical one is still, some people want some sort of measure of engagement in here. But we're changing the focus of engagement in this respect, not necessarily putting it in the heart of the model. Now, one of the things we do with these observable outcomes is that, this is the starting point. It's a starting point for us when we're talking about, designing a survey for a client. It's also the starting point. If you just want to have a conversation about your people experience, you can use the same framework. And that's one of the things we want to get across in this webinar. But these outcomes are your starting point. What do we care about here? What really matters? When we talk about if you want to talk about engagement, let's do that. But what do you mean by engagement? What does it look like in your organization? What really matters to you? Getting beyond, those rigid ideas about employee engagement that maybe you've been given by another provider.
I guess the thing that
none of them are perfect, and nothing either. So it's a bit like we say, so tell us what's important. And clients will tell us things like, well, retention is really important to us right now. Right, okay, so we'll have something in there about people's intention to stay. Now that's the sort of thing that we're often being in engagement, an engagement survey anyway, but we're having a conversation about the rationale for having that question in there. Attraction, okay, so we're going to talk about advocacy, let's have something in there about that. But equally, like I say, it could be well-being, stress, burnout type questions. We've even brought performance ratings into the equation, all sorts of things. But that is your starting point.
I think the thing for me, and I guess when you came, I remember the meeting, Rob, when you came and said, I've done some meta-analysis of what's out there. I've looked at the research documents. I've gone through what academia has looked into and what we're seeing actually in a corporate world. And for this stuff, you've got to stay authentic. Is my view. I don't want to work in an organization that doesn't have a clear purpose or isn't authentic about that purpose. And looking at this, for me, and I don't want this to come across as, well, I would say that because I work in this organization. But I think the first thing for me was around, when I think about people analytics and presenting data to people, the complexity comes from the granularity, and actually being able to lift this up into 3 clear areas, an environmental, an experiential, and an outcome area, feels feels more manageable. It actually I feel calmer about understanding a lot of data that's going to be coming in and data points. You know, is there something more environmental that I need to start looking at? And is there something more experiential? How does the environment impact the experience? How does the experience impact the environment? If I want to affect an outcome, if I want to improve an area, how do I do that? Where do I go? And it felt a lot easier as well in terms of this. And it felt like something as well that a line manager in a business could look at and go, I understand this. I understand the environment that I work in. I understand the experience and how I feel working in that environment. And I also think about outcomes, and whether that is, you know, something like well-being, which is important to organizations. They can understand how that all fits together. And I guess a lot of what you talked about in terms of engagement, if we think about engagement, it's got to sit between outcome and experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's interesting is when you look at the theory, a lot of the theory would describe, you know, cognitive engagement, emotional engagement, and behavioral engagement differently. And those, in many respects, that felt experience part is a broader view of that cognitive engagement. Because cognitive engagement is, I evaluate my experience here positively. The behavioral engagement is, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to put in that discretionary effort. And then the emotional engagement is, I'm committed. I want to be here. I want to, want everything that's good for the company. So in many respects, that's what the felt experience is. And what's interesting is that we're actually, it's early days, but we're actually seeing such a strong correlation between when we measure this felt experience and then when we also measure engagement. We're seeing such a strong correlation between the two. It makes me feel very confident that actually what we are doing is describing engagement in a different way, but we're still describing engagement. I'll go into what these different elements are just now. I think it's a good time to do that. As if my cursor can work. There we go. So when we talk about the felt experience, this is the middle part, and this is what we think of as the core. And these are all different elements that, based on a variety of motivational theories, some of people would recognize stuff like some elements of things like self-determination theory, intrinsic motivation, etc. But it's a bit broader than that. And we've changed some of the terminology to make it a little bit more, friendly. Belonging is about, I feel that I belong here without sacrificing or without compromising my own identity. Connections about the relationships that I have here. Autonomy, we can all understand that to some degree, which is about both the freedom to act and to make choices that influence my work. Growth, which is not only about improving or developing my skills and knowledge, but feeling that I'm allowed to make use of my skills and knowledge from day to day. Purpose is not necessarily about changing the world, but it's feeling that I have a sense of direction. Work gives me a sense of direction, perhaps personal meaning as well. And then enjoyment, which is often overlooked, but that's about, do I find my work interesting, stimulating, and sometimes it can be, do I have fun at work? So these, and the key thing here is that this may not be 100% complete, because we are, what we're doing every time now we run the surveys is we're improving our data set, and we will keep analyzing and we'll keep refining this. But it feels reasonably comprehensive. But what we can say is that, look, each of these things have different implications for you as a business. If you're going to be going through tough times as a business, and you need to bring people along on the journey with you, that belonging, that is absolutely critical. Now, that's a different rationale for, say, to say D&I. And D&I policy and practice and stuff is all sort of stuff we would put in the perceived environment. We take out belonging. A lot of survey providers will combine those into one dimension, but we say actually the practice and the policies around this stuff sitting the perceived environment, the actual whether I feel I could belong or not sits here. But things like autonomy, like if you want agility, innovation, in your business, bottom-up change, then autonomy is going to be really important. So that there's different. Each of these has different implications in terms of business performance. And what we do in terms of that, actually navigating the people experience and building that experience. I mean, by the way, everybody who's registered for the webinar will get a guide to help them with some of this thinking. In terms of that, once you know those outcomes that are important to you, it becomes a lot easier to have a conversation about which of these elements do we think is going to be really important to us in the next little while. And even if you're not measuring it, even if you're just having this conversation and sort of just designing from the ground up. So which ones do you think are going to be important? Well, that's so much easier if you put those outcomes clear. And then once you've had that conversation and decided, well, these are our priorities in terms of the people, in terms of the actual felt experience, then it becomes so much easier to have a conversation about, well, what touch points are important to us and how should we manage those? So what's the implication of this for line management? What's the implication of this for communication? How are we going to communicate differently? What about the physical environment? How do we align that? How do we align our processes? All that sort of stuff becomes an easier conversation once you build this sort of sense of clarity.
And I think,
so like I say, you can have this as a conversation, or you can analyze data.
And the bit I think that's interesting around this is that obviously, asking questions around these areas, understanding that overall experience is great. And I think the stuff that I just love about it is stuff like, we concentrate on stuff like belonging, a sense of belonging in an organization, and combining that together with the stuff around inclusion and the practices of inclusion, that what's happening in the organization, be that policy or be that change that the organization is going through, separating it all of a sudden just makes more sense. That makes more sense that I can understand the environmental impact and belonging as two different things, but the same concept across the piece.
We'll show a little bit of analysis in a moment, because I think it highlights the value of looking at these things differently. But there have been studies out there saying D&I policy and practice isn't necessarily improving people's sense of belonging, and it doesn't mean there's not a good reason to do, to have a diverse and inclusive workplace. There are many good reasons to. Not least an ethical or moral, reason. But sometimes, if you want to drive belonging, you realize there are different ways of doing that. And that's what this, if we take you to this is a real example of something that came out of the analysis we did with a client recently. And there's a lot of information on the page, so, don't sweat it. What this represents is a handful of relationships between questions. You can see the 3 levels in operation here. And we just focused on 3 questions because they were influential in the overall results, if you like. They had a high influence on felt experience and engagement as an outcome. And there were, to provide some context to this slide, there were, I think in this survey, created something like 946 relationships between questions, and these were just some of the most powerful ones. And what it showed us is, on the left-hand side in the perceived environment, a strong influence or a strong focus on things like managing performance or creating a performance environment. People are held to account for delivering. In my team, we apply learning. And there's a longer question there, is whether or not we have, whether or not we have succeeded. And then my line manager challenges me to exceed expectations, which is the most interesting because it's got 4 of these relationships coming out of it. And just the fact that my line manager, challenges me to exceed expectations in this organization means I'm more likely to feel like I'm involved in key decisions. I'm more likely to say that I can be my real self here. I'm more likely to feel trusted by other team members, and I'm more likely to believe that I'm personally developed. Now, you wouldn't necessarily have expected to see this. And it provides, so it gives us far more insight than just than we might have gotten. And what it said allowed us to have this conversation with our client was, look, you're interested in things like belonging, you're interested in building relationships. Look, your line managers are not only key, but the way they manage performance and being very performance focused is not only supportive of things like growth, it's supportive of better relationships. It's supportive of a feeling of belonging.
And I think, Rob, the difference,
that is really powerful.
The difference here as well is compared to other stuff, just creating a stack of results of, your belonging score is this, your connection score is that, is all of a sudden, as if I think about my days working in HR, I'm now thinking about if line managers challenging people to exceed expectations has a massive impact across an organization and touches so many different things, then my focus as someone in HR, my focus as somebody who has learning, development, capability under that umbrella and supporting an organization to deliver that becomes more focused on, I need to help my line managers understand how to challenge people to exceed expectations in a positive and values-driven way, in a way that will achieve that result. So my focus then suddenly starts going on my largest management population probably in any organization, and the pinch point between the pressures that come up from employees sitting below the line manager level and the ask sitting above the line manager level. We know that there's a pinch point at line managers, but actually helping our line managers challenge people to exceed expectations and doing it well and doing it in a human way and doing it in a values-driven way will impact multiple things. And ultimately, if the outcome that we're looking for is engagement based on this concept of engagement, we're moving away from the concept of I want to improve belonging, I want to improve autonomy. It feels more holistic.
Yeah, it improves, it's more holistic, it's more insightful, it gives you more precise, I remember when I first started doing some employee research, my manager was saying to me, if you work in consumer research, what they're looking for is a bullseye. They're looking for something that they can go, that is a basis for doing something. And that's what we're trying to do here. And we go, you know what, there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff here. There's a whole bunch of things that you're doing well on, a whole bunch of things you could be doing better on. But look at this. This is value. And that's where we're trying to get to. And this is where we go to with, kind of little conscious of the time here. So, this is where you don't get that kind of value, you don't get that level of insight from doing, a flat survey. And that's, what still a lot of employee surveys are just a list grouped into themes, and there's no basis for analysis other than that's high, that's low. And
this was actually my next question, Rob. So as we move away from a flat survey, so I think about the flat survey as being a descriptive analytics where we display these are the results. You've run a survey and these are the results of the survey. The highs, the lows, the high performing, the low performing. And if I think about our own journey as we've come, it's probably I think you described it the other day in our team meeting as 3 phases, and the phase 1 being that flat survey. Phase 2, talking about finding those key drivers. And phase 3, where we're up to now, is about actually driving insight. And I'm sure you said it in a far more eloquent way than I just have.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that the next level that quite a lot of survey providers are at now is that idea of the drivers. What are your drivers of engagement? And that basically says, okay, everything else is flat, but you've got engagement as well. So which of these are your best predictor of your engagement score? But what we can do with this 3-level model is go a step further, and you can see the path. So if I change this, that will happen in terms of felt experience. Now that's interesting because it will have implications in terms of different ways of performing, if you like, within the organization. But we can also understand what it will do in terms of engagement. And we move, and you can see that we're lined up to individual questions here, because if you say, well, what we really want is, for example, people to be ready to embrace the changing agenda, or to use a different example, we really want people to want to stay here. Then you can track back and go, well, what's going to have the biggest influence on that in terms of feeling?
And I think this will really help with stuff where we are really thinking about belonging differently, and we're thinking about belonging broader than just legislated requirements or protected characteristics, and we're thinking about belonging as a far broader concept in organization. This can really help. And I mean, you mentioned time earlier, and I guess we talk about analytics, and we were talking about that flat data, moving away, or keeping descriptive charting and descriptive data visualization, because that's super important for people to be able to understand what people have said, moving into this where actually this is now about taking action. And I mean, I guess we're moving into the last 10 minutes. The takeaways from this, when people are thinking about the people experience in an organization, when people are thinking about that, and everything that everyone's just watched now around, how do you move? And I think the term used was beyond engagement. How do we think beyond engagement to a more holistic people experience? What are the takeaways right now that you would have for people?
The takeaways, I think, really are kind of grounded in the levels of the framework. Because I think that thing about, first of all, be really clear about your measures of success. As a business, what are your people priorities? What are the implications of those? What are your business priorities? And what are the implications of those in terms of things like capability, behaviors, motivations, etc. Then that allows you, number 2, really think about the kind of that experience in that sort of holistic way. So which elements of experience, what kinds of experience are actually going to drive this, are going to really support this? So they're good, so you might say, for example, we want people to feel like they belong. Of course you want people to feel like they belong, but is it currently more important than people feeling like they're growing, that they're competent? Is it more important than people feeling, for example, that they're enjoying work? And the benefits that brings in terms of things like being open to change, being open to new ideas, taking risks. So there's lots of different elements there. So think about those, and then and only then start to think about those touching points of levers. Because I know I've been in HR and I've spent a lot of time with HR people. We often start here and go, I think we need a management development program. I think we need to do this. I think we need to do that. Actually, if you wait, have that conversation last, once you've thought about the type of experience you want to create, then you're going to be more focused on stuff that's going to have a greater impact and ultimately create more business value. And that's what an awful lot of HR people want to be able to do.
I've got I have a question, which is a question from me actually. And I understand why we look for concepts, that we look for something that is simpler to explain, that is a simple framework or a simple concept. So I understand how we've moved away from probably a satisfaction model into an engagement model. So if you think about literature from 60s, 70s, early 80s, where it talks about satisfaction more than engagement moving. I understand that because people need to simplify something. And I do worry sometimes that I oversimplify some of this stuff. And in front of everyone, I'm going to ask the question to make sure that I'm not oversimplifying it. I think when I look at this, if I was an individual receiving this, I think I would say that the stuff in perceived environment is stuff that I have more control over as an individual, and therefore I understand why I'd want to focus on those levers. So pulling a lever with line manager training and upskilling line managers actually is far more preferable to me than somebody saying solve belonging in this organization, because I don't know what to do. Because if you said to me solve inclusion, solve belonging, solve growth, I'd probably just throw some money at something, or I'd throw some resource at something. And I don't, because I'm obviously going to go and talk to clients about this and other people about this in the future. Am I oversimplifying that?
No, not really, not at all. Because you can't fix belonging, you can't fix growth, you can't fix enjoyment, you can't make people enjoy their work. You have to build that environment. What you can do is evaluate your environment, evaluate what you're doing currently through those lenses, and make your choices as to which parts of the environment and the experience, what types of experience are important to you right now. What are we going to do next? Okay, but we're going to focus on this. How can we then evaluate those touch points through those lenses? And you can analyze as well. You can do some analysis if you're running, survey. You can say, well, what is having the biggest impact on belonging? And
I guess what this data does is it takes away that, or it enriches that prescriptive stuff. And I remember doing our analysis where we found that one in 5 people said that they struggled to deliver the work they were given in the time they were given to deliver that, and that was an outcome. Yeah, or that was what they told us. And we did a bit of work that said actually an outcome of that was employee burnout. So where we could see that the outcome was burnout, we could see that workload led to burnout, but it still felt very two-dimensional. And I'd love to be able to explore those questions with this broader framework to understand, actually, is there something experiential that is driving environmental, and because it doesn't feel like it's linear to me. It doesn't feel like it's the environment, the experience, the outcome, because surely the outcome affects the environment.
Yeah,
the experience affects the outcome. So it's all circling back on itself. I have a poor experience because of something. It can make someone else's environment poor.
Yeah, absolutely. What this is a simplification, and what I hope is it doesn't oversimplify too much. It's not perfect. You said, you've mentioned something about answering different questions. It's not going to answer every question, and sometimes we'll come across something. We'll say, well, actually, we need to measure that differently. Use something new to measure that, and maybe it'll improve our framework. There's a hand up question.
Sorry to interrupt again. We have had a few more questions on our webinar Q&A. Question 1, the point of moving away from employee engagement as a KPI is great, but how do I help my senior managers make this move also?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, it ultimately a little bit of it becomes an evidence-based conversation. I think what happens is that senior management get very wedded to showing this is where we were, this is last year, this is the year before, and this is this year, and we're showing progress. And sometimes you've got to be able to be prepared to break that cycle and say, well, actually, what we were measuring isn't maybe actually what's most relevant to us now. And there's a little bit of vulnerability involved in that for a senior manager. So recognizing that, taking them through the a bit of an evidence-based conversation, I think
there's something in there as well, isn't there, about we're not effectively diminishing the term engagement. We're broadening it. We're saying that actually it sits across a few different areas in this framework, and therefore it's not something that you have to start measuring. And if as an organization you need a little bit of time to think about moving away from it as our killer KPI, then that's absolutely fine. I think it's more a case of going, actually, is there the appetite to do that? Do people understand the framework? And ultimately, what do I get out of having that as a number? And I think what we're talking about here is actually there's a lot of, we've said complexity sits within the granularity of the reporting of the data. So to bring that up into a number that can be reported or talked about is good. I mean, we've used the People Experience Hub score as an overall index, Rob. If you were to use a number across this, what would it be? A designed number? What would it be?
There's an argument for using what we've done before, which is the PX score, which is everything. There's an argument for using the felt experience as an overall score. There's an argument for saying, actually, one of the things you could do is say, we're not going to get rid of our engagement score just now, but maybe we'll add to it. Let's add a well-being score. And then eventually you might say, well, actually, maybe this is more important than that. So whenever you need to report a score, there are always potential pitfalls to that, and you can't avoid that. But I think it's probably a bit broadening the thinking.
Excellent.
And question 2, so when I said I'm not confident with analytics, how would I improve this, as I find a lot of it quite complex?
I think it's we've had that question quite a lot. So I think for me, I remember I used to teach the analytics courses with the CIPD, and they'd get that question often from people, which was, I think sometimes, firstly, I think people are trying to do something that they're not designed to do, and that other people who are analysts and data specialists are great at. But the true measure of success of any analytics, any output of data, any data visualization, is that it can be understood by anybody. And people consume data and analysis of data on a regular basis. You know, you can't log on to social media without getting some level of impact. I get my water bill and it has charts on the back of it telling me usage and statistics. And I think if it's complex, it might just be because it's too complex. And there's an element there which is actually simplifying the outputs rather than trying to educate yourself to be an analyst, is probably the step I would take. And certainly one of the views that we've taken, which is, you know, if we think about user experience of any platform, it has to be simple. People have to understand it and say, I get this, I get it. The risk of having a framework which is more complex than 3 elements, which is why I love just saying it. Look, it's 3 things. It's environment, experience, and outcomes, is because it simplifies reporting and analytics. So I'd probably say, look, if it's bugging you, give us a call, and I'm more than happy to talk to people through. The CIPD courses are great. There's lots of great courses out there that give you a good foundation, but don't try to succeed where an analyst will succeed if that's not your skill set. You know, I'm good on Excel, but there's no way I could go and write in Python or R or analytical languages. So, you know, it's not something that I will try and do.
Any more? Conscious it's 12 o'clock now. We're happy to stay, but we might start losing people. Any more questions?
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Luna, Kate. Hope you all enjoyed it, and we will we'll be holding another webinar next month and future webinars as well. We'll be sure to communicate it via social and our newsletter.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks
Rob.
for joining us. Cheers.
Bye.